All that is solid melts into air. Marx, Modernism, and Modernization. There followed on the birth of mechanization and modern industry, a violent encroachment like that of an avalanche in its intensity and its extent. All bounds of morals and nature, of age and sex, of day and night, were broken down. Capital celebrated its orgies. Capital, Volume 1. I am the spirit that negates all. Mephistopheles in Faust. Innovative self-destruction. Ad for Mobil Oil, 1978. In the research racks at Shearson Hayden Stone Incorporated, a commodity letter bears this quotation from Heraclitus. All is flux, nothing stays still. Shearson chief builds a new Wall Street giant. Story in New York Times, 1979. That apparent disorder that is in actuality the highest degree of bourgeois order. Dostoevsky in London, 1862. We have seen how Goethe's Faust, universally regarded as a prime expression of the modern spiritual quest, reaches its fulfillment, but also its tragic catastrophe, in the transformation of modern material life. We will soon see how the real force and originality of Marx's historical materialism is the light it sheds on modern spiritual life. Both writers share a perspective that was far more widely shared in their time than it is in our own, a belief that modern life comprises a coherent whole. This sense of wholeness underlies Pushkin's judgment of Faust as an Iliad of modern life. It presupposes a unity of life and experience that embraces modern politics and psychology, modern industry and spirituality, the modern ruling classes and the modern working classes. This chapter will attempt to recover and reconstruct Marx's vision of modern life as a whole. It is worth noting that this sense of wholeness goes against the grain of contemporary thought. Current thinking about modernity is broken into two different compartments, hermetically sealed off from one another. Modernization in economics and politics, modernism in art, culture, and sensibility. If we try to locate Marx amid this dualism, we will find that, not surprisingly, he bulks large in the literature on modernization. Even writers who claim to refute him generally recognize his work as a primary source and point of reference for their own. On the other hand, in the literature of modernism, Marx is not recognized in any way at all. Modernist culture and consciousness are often traced back to his generation, the generation of the 1840s, to Baudelaire, Flaubert, Wagner, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky. But Marx himself does not rate even a branch in this genealogical tree. If he is even mentioned in this company, it is as a foil, or sometimes as a survival of an earlier and more innocent age, the Enlightenment, say, whose clear vistas and solid values modernism had supposedly destroyed. Some writers, like Vladimir Nabokov, depict Marxism as a dead weight that crushes the modernist spirit. Others, like Georg Lukács in his communist years, see Marx's outlook as far saner, healthier, and more real than those of the modernists. But everybody seems to agree that he and they are worlds apart. And yet, the closer we get to what Marx actually said, the less this dualism makes sense. Take an image like this: all that is solid melts into air. The cosmic scope and visionary grandeur of this image, its highly compressed and dramatic power, its vaguely apocalyptic undertones, the ambiguity of its point of view, the heat that destroys is also superabundant energy, an overflow of life. All these qualities are supposed to be hallmarks of the modernist imagination. They are just the sort of thing we are prepared to find in Rimbaud or Nietzsche, Rilke or Yeats. Things fall apart. The center does not hold. In fact, this image comes from Marx, and not from any esoteric, long-hidden early manuscript, but from the heart of the Communist Manifesto. It comes as the climax of Marx's description of modern bourgeois society. The affinities between Marx and the modernists are even clearer if we look at the whole of the sentence from which our image is drawn. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. and men at last are forced to face, with sober senses, the real conditions of their lives and their relations with their fellow men. Marx's second clause, which proclaims the destruction of everything holy, is more complex and more interesting than the standard 19th century materialist assertion that God does not exist. Marx is moving in the dimension of time, working to evoke an ongoing historical drama and trauma. He is saying that the aura of holiness is suddenly missing, and that we cannot understand ourselves in the present until we confront what is absent. The final clause, and men at last are forced to face, not only describes a confrontation with a perplexing reality, but acts it out, forces it on the reader, and indeed on the writer too. For men, die Menschen, as Marx says, are all in it together, at once subjects and objects of the pervasive process that melts everything solid into air. If we follow this modernist melting vision, we will find it throughout Marx's works. Everywhere it pulls like an undertow against the more solid Marxian visions we know so well. It is especially vivid and striking in the Communist Manifesto. Indeed, it opens up a whole new perspective on the manifesto as the archetype of a century of modernist manifestos and movements to come. The manifesto expresses some of modernist culture's deepest insights and, at the same time, dramatizes some of its deepest inner contradictions. At this point, it would not be unreasonable to ask, aren't there already more than enough interpretations of Marx? Do we really need a modernist Marx? A kindred spirit of Eliot and Kafka and Schoenberg and Gertrude Stein and Artaud? I think we do, not only because he's there, but because he has something distinctive and important to say. Marx, in fact, can tell us as much about modernism as it can tell us about him. Modernist thought, so brilliant in illuminating the dark side of everyone and everything, turns out to have some repressed dark corners of its own, and Marx can shine new light on these. Specifically, he can clarify the relationship between modernist culture and the bourgeois economy and society, the world of modernization, from which it has sprung. We will see that they have far more in common than either modernists or bourgeoisie would like to think. We will see Marxism, modernism, and the bourgeoisie caught up in a strange dialectical dance, and if we follow their movements, we can learn some important things about the modern world we all share. 1. The melting vision and its dialectic. The central drama for which the manifesto is famous is the development of the modern bourgeoisie and proletariat, and the struggle between them. But we can find a play going on within this play, a struggle inside the author's consciousness over what is really going on, and what the larger struggle means. We might describe this conflict as a tension between Marx's solid and his melting visions of modern life. The manifesto's first section, Bourgeois and Proletarians, sets out to present an overview of what is now called the process of modernization, and sets the stage for what Marx believes will be its revolutionary climax. Here, Marx describes the solid institutional core of modernity. First of all, there is the emergence of a world market. As it spreads, it absorbs and destroys whatever local and regional markets it touches. Production and consumption, and human needs, become increasingly international and cosmopolitan. The scope of human desires and demands is enlarged far beyond the capacities of local industries, which consequently collapse. The scale of communications becomes worldwide, and technologically sophisticated mass media emerge. Capital is concentrated increasingly in a few hands. Independent peasants and artisans cannot compete with capitalist mass production, and they are forced to leave the land and close their workshops. Production is increasingly centralized and rationalized in highly automated factories. It is no different in the country, where farms became factories in the field, and the peasants who do not leave the countryside are transformed into agricultural proletarians. Vast numbers of the uprooted poor pour into cities, which grow almost magically, and cataclysmically, overnight. In order for these great changes to go on with relative smoothness, some legal, fiscal, and administrative centralization must take place. And it does take place wherever capitalism goes. National states arise and accumulate great power, although that power is continually undermined by capital's international scope. Meanwhile, industrial workers gradually awaken to some sort of class consciousness and activate themselves against the acute misery and chronic oppression in which they live. As we read this, we find ourselves on familiar ground. These processes are still going on around us, and a century of Marxism has helped to establish a language in which they make sense. As we read on, however, if we read with our full attention, strange things begin to happen. Marx's prose suddenly becomes luminous, incandescent. Brilliant images succeed and blend into one another. We are hurtled along with a reckless momentum, a breathless intensity. Marx is not only describing, but evoking and enacting the desperate pace and frantic rhythm that capitalism imparts to every facet of modern life. He makes us feel that we are part of the action, drawn into the stream, hurtled along, out of control, at once dazzled and menaced by the onward rush. After a few pages of this, we are exhilarated but perplexed. We find that the solid social formations around us have melted away. By the time Marx's proletarians finally appear, the world stage on which they were supposed to play their part has disintegrated and metamorphosed into something unrecognizable, surreal, a mobile construction that shifts and changes shape under the player's feet. It is as if the innate dynamism of the melting vision has run away with Marx and carried him, and the workers, and us, far beyond the range of his intended plot, to a point where his revolutionary scripts will have to be radically reworked. The paradoxes at the heart of the manifesto are manifest almost at its very start. Specifically, from the moment Marx starts to describe the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie, he begins, has played a most revolutionary role in history. What is startling about Marx's next few pages is that he seems to have come not to bury the bourgeoisie, but to praise it. He writes an impassioned, enthusiastic, often lyrical celebration of bourgeois works, ideas, and achievements. Indeed, in these pages, he manages to praise the bourgeoisie more powerfully and profoundly than its members have ever known how to praise themselves. What have the bourgeois done to deserve Marx's praise? First of all, they have been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. Marx does not mean that they have been the first to celebrate the idea of vita activa, an activistic stance toward the world. This has been a central theme of Western culture since the Renaissance. It has taken on new depths and resonances in Marx's own century, in the age of Romanticism and Revolution, of Napoleon and Byron and Goethe's Faust. Marx himself will develop it in new directions, and it will go on evolving into our own era. Marx's point is that what modern poets, artists, and intellectuals have only dreamed of, the modern bourgeoisie has actually done. Thus it has accomplished wonders that far surpass Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put all former migrations of nations and crusades in the shade. Its genius for activity expresses itself first in great projects of physical construction, mills and factories, bridges and canals, railroads, all the public works that constitute Faust's final achievement. These are the pyramids and cathedrals of the modern age. Next, there are the immense movements of peoples, to cities, to frontiers, to new lands, which the bourgeoisie has sometimes inspired, sometimes brutally enforced, sometimes subsidized, and always exploited for profit. Marx, in a stirring, evocative paragraph, transmits the rhythm and drama of bourgeois activism. The bourgeoisie, in its reign of barely 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive power than have all previous generations put together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to agriculture and industry, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even an intimation that such productive power slept in the womb of social labor? Marx is neither the first nor the last writer to celebrate the triumphs of modern bourgeois technology and social organization, but his paean is distinctive both in what it emphasizes and in what it leaves out. Although Marx identifies himself as a materialist, he is not primarily interested in the things that the bourgeoisie creates. What matters to him is the processes, the powers, the expressions of human life and energy. Men working, moving, cultivating, communicating, organizing, and reorganizing nature and themselves, the new and endlessly renewed modes of activity that the bourgeoisie brings into being. Marx does not dwell much on particular inventions and innovations in their own right. In the tradition that runs from Saint-Simon through McLuhan, what stirs him is the active and generative process through which one thing leads to another, Dreams metamorphose into blueprints, and fantasies into balance sheets. The wildest and most extravagant ideas get acted on and acted out. Whole populations conjured out of the ground, and ignite and nourish new forms of life and action. The irony of bourgeois activism, as Marx sees it, is that the bourgeoisie is forced to close itself off from its richest possibilities, possibilities that can be realized only by those who break its power. For all the marvelous modes of activity the bourgeoisie has opened up, the only activity that really means anything to its members is making money, accumulating capital, piling up surplus value. All their enterprises are merely means to this end, in themselves of no more than transient and intermediary interest. The active powers and processes that mean so much to Marx appear as mere incidental byproducts in the minds of their producers. Nevertheless, the bourgeois have established themselves as the first ruling class, whose authority is based not on who their ancestors were, but on what they themselves actually do. They have produced vivid new images and paradigms of the good life as a life of action. They have proved that it is possible, through organized and concerted action, to really change the world. Alas, to the bourgeois' embarrassment, they cannot afford to look down the roads they have opened up. The great wide vistas may turn into abysses. They can go on playing their revolutionary role only by denying its full extent and depth, but radical thinkers and workers are free to see where the roads lead, and to take them. If the good life is a life of action, why should the range of human activities be limited to those that are profitable? And why should modern men, who have seen what man's activity can bring about, passively accept the structure of their society as it is given? Since organized and concerted action can change the world in so many ways, why not organize and work together and fight to change it still more? The revolutionary activity, practical critical activity, that overthrows bourgeois rule will be an expression of the active and activistic energies that the bourgeoisie itself has set free. Marx began by praising the bourgeoisie, not by burying it. But if his dialectic works out, it will be the virtues for which he praised the bourgeoisie that will bury it in the end. The second great bourgeois achievement has been to liberate the human capacity and drive for development, for permanent change, for perpetual upheaval and renewal in every mode of personal and social life. This drive, Marx shows, is embedded in the everyday workings and needs of the bourgeois economy. Everybody within reach of this economy finds himself under pressure of relentless competition, whether from across the street or across the world. Under pressure, every bourgeois, from the pettiest to the most powerful, is forced to innovate, simply in order to keep his business and himself afloat. Anyone who does not actively change on his own will become a passive victim of changes draconically imposed by those who dominate the market. This means that the bourgeoisie, taken as a whole, cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the means of production. But the forces that shape and drive the modern economy cannot be compartmentalized and cut off from the totality of life. The intense and relentless pressure to revolutionize production is bound to spill over and transform what Marx calls conditions of production, or, alternately, productive relationships as well, and with them all social conditions and relationships. At this point, propelled by the desperate dynamism he is striving to grasp, Marx makes a great imaginative leap. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social relations, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier times. All fixed, fast-frozen relationships, with their train of venerable ideas and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become obsolete before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and men at last are forced to face with sober senses the real conditions of their lives and their relations with their fellow men. Where does all this leave us, the members of modern bourgeois society? It leaves us all in strange and paradoxical positions. Our lives are controlled by a ruling class with vested interests, not merely in change, but in crisis and chaos. Uninterrupted disturbance, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, instead of subverting this society, actually serve to strengthen it. Catastrophes are transformed into lucrative opportunities for redevelopment and renewal. Disintegration works as a mobilizing and hence an integrating force. The one spectre that really haunts the modern ruling class and that really endangers the world it has created in its image is the one thing that traditional elites, and for that matter, traditional masses, have always yearned for: prolonged solid stability. In this world, stability can only mean entropy, slow death, while our sense of progress and growth is our only way of knowing for sure that we are alive. To say that our society is falling apart is only to say that it is alive and well. What kinds of people does this permanent revolution produce? In order for people, whatever their class, to survive in modern society, their personalities must take on the fluid and open form of this society. Modern men and women must learn to yearn for change, not merely to be open to changes in their personal and social lives, but positively to demand them, actively to seek them out and carry them through. They must learn not to long nostalgically for the fixed, fast-frozen relationships of the real or fantasized past, but to delight in mobility, to thrive on renewal, to look forward to future developments in their conditions of life and their relations with their fellow men. Marx absorbs this developmental ideal from the German humanist culture of his youth, from the thought of Goethe and Schiller and their romantic successes. This theme and its development is still very much alive in our own day. Erik Erikson is its most distinguished living exponent, may be Germany's deepest and most lasting contribution to world culture. Marx is perfectly clear about his links to these writers, whom he is constantly citing and alluding to, and to their intellectual tradition. But he understands, as most of his predecessors did not. The crucial exception is the aged Goethe, the author of Faust Part II. That the humanistic ideal of self-development grows out of the emerging reality of bourgeois economic development. Thus, for all Marx's invective against the bourgeois economy, he embraces enthusiastically the personality structure that this economy has produced. The trouble with capitalism is that, here as elsewhere, it destroys the human possibilities it creates. It fosters, indeed forces, self-development for everybody, but people can develop only in restricted and distorted ways. Those traits, impulses, and talents that the market can use are rushed, often prematurely, into development and squeezed desperately till there is nothing left. Everything else within us, everything non-marketable, gets draconically repressed, or withers away for lack of use, or never has a chance to come to life at all. The ironic and happy solution to this contradiction will occur, Marx says, when the development of modern industry cuts from under its feet the very grounds on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. The inner life and energy of bourgeois development will sweep away the class that first brought it to life. We can see this dialectical movement as much in the sphere of personal as in economic development. In a system where all relationships are volatile, how can capitalist forms of life, private property, wage labor, exchange value, the insatiable pursuit of profit, alone hold still? Where the desires and sensibilities of people in every class have become open-ended and insatiable, attuned to permanent upheavals in every sphere of life, what can possibly keep them fixed and frozen in their bourgeois roles? The more furiously bourgeois society agitates its members to grow or die, the more likely they will be to outgrow it itself. The more furiously they will eventually turn it as a drag on their growth. The more implacably they will fight it in the name of the new life it has forced them to seek. Thus capitalism will be melted by the heat of its own incandescent energies. After the revolution, in the course of development, after wealth is redistributed, class privileges are wiped away, education is free and universal, and workers control the ways in which work is organized, then, so Marx prophesies at the manifesto's climactic moment, then, at last, in place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we will have an association in which the free development of each will be the condition for the free development of all. Then the experience of self-development, released from the demands and distortions of the market, can go on freely and spontaneously. Instead of the nightmare that bourgeois society has made it, it can be a source of joy and beauty for all. I want to step back from the Communist Manifesto for a moment to emphasize how crucial the developmental ideal is to Marx, from his earliest writings to his last. His youthful essay on estranged labor, or alienated labor, written in 1844, proclaims, as the truly human alternative to estranged labor, work that will enable the individual to freely develop his physical and spiritual or mental energies. In the German ideology, 1845-6, the goal of communism is the development of a totality of capacities in the individuals themselves. For only in community with others has each individual the means of cultivating his gifts in all directions. Only in the community, therefore, is personal freedom possible. In Volume 1 of Capital, in the chapter on machinery and modern industry, it is essential to communism that it transcend the capitalist division of labor. The partially developed individual, who is merely the bearer of one specialized social function, must be replaced by the fully developed individual, fit for a variety of labors, ready to face any change in production, for whom the different social functions he performs are only so many modes of giving free scope to his own natural and acquired powers. This vision of communism is unmistakably modern, first of all in its individualism, but even more in its ideal of development as the form of the good life. Here Marx is closer to some of his bourgeois and liberal enemies than he is to traditional exponents of communism, who, since Plato and the Church Fathers, have sanctified self-sacrifice, distrusted or loathed individuality, and yearned for a still point at which all strife and all striving will reach an end. Once again, we find Marx more responsive to what is going on in bourgeois society than are the members and supporters of the bourgeoisie themselves. He sees in the dynamics of capitalist development, both the development of each individual and of society as a whole, a new image of the good life. Not a life of definitive perfection, not the embodiment of prescribed static essences, but a process of continual, restless, open-ended, unbounded growth. Thus he hopes to heal the wounds of modernity through a fuller and deeper modernity. 2. Innovative self-destruction. We can see now why Marx gets so excited and enthusiastic about the bourgeoisie and the world it has made. Now we must confront something even more perplexing. Next to the Communist Manifesto, the whole body of capitalist apologetics, from Adam Ferguson to Milton Friedman, is remarkably pale and empty of life. The celebrants of capitalism tell us surprisingly little of its infinite horizons, its revolutionary energy and audacity, its dynamic creativity, its adventurousness and romance, its capacity to make men not merely more comfortable, but more alive. The bourgeoisie and its ideologists have never been known for their humility or modesty, yet they seem strangely determined to hide much of their light under a bushel. The reason, I think, is that there is a dark side to this light that they cannot blot out. They are dimly aware of this, and deeply embarrassed and frightened by it, to the point that they will ignore or deny their own strength and creativity, rather than look their virtues in the face and live with them. What is it that the members of the bourgeoisie are afraid to recognize in themselves? Not their drive to exploit people, to treat them purely as means, or, in economic rather than moral language, as commodities. The bourgeoisie, as Marx sees it, doesn't lose much sleep over this. After all, they do it to one another, and even to themselves, so why shouldn't they do it to everybody else? The real source of trouble is the bourgeois claim to be the party of order in modern politics and culture. The immense amounts of money and energy put into building, and the self-consciously monumental character of so much of this building, indeed, throughout Marx's century, every table and chair in a bourgeois interior resembled a monument, testify to the sincerity and seriousness of this claim. And yet, the truth of the matter, as Marx sees, is that everything that bourgeois society builds is built to be torn down. All that is solid, from the clothes on our backs to the looms and mills that weave them, to the men and women who work the machines, to the houses and neighborhoods the workers live in, to the firms and corporations that exploit the workers, to the towns and cities and whole regions and even nations that embrace them all these are made to be broken tomorrow, smashed or shredded or pulverized or dissolved, so they can be recycled or replaced next week. And the whole process can go on again and again, hopefully forever, in ever more profitable forms. The pathos of all bourgeois monuments is that their material strength and solidity actually count for nothing and carry no weight at all. That they are blown away like frail reeds by the very forces of capitalist development that they celebrate. Even the most beautiful and impressive bourgeois buildings and public works are disposable, capitalized for fast depreciation and planned to be obsolete, closer in their social functions to tents and encampments than to Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, Gothic cathedrals. If we look behind the sober scenes that the members of our bourgeoisie create, and see the way they really work and act, we see that these solid citizens would tear down the world if it paid. Even as they frighten everyone with fantasies of proletarian rapacity and revenge, they themselves, through their inexhaustible dealing and developing, hurtle masses of men, materials, and money up and down the earth, and erode or explode the foundations of everyone's lives as they go. Their secret, a secret they have managed to keep even from themselves, is that behind their facades, they are the most violently destructive ruling class in history. All the anarchic, measureless, explosive drives that a later generation will baptize by the name of nihilism, drives that Nietzsche and his followers will ascribe to such cosmic traumas as the death of God, are located by Marx in the seemingly banal everyday working of the market economy. He unveils the modern bourgeois as consummate nihilists on a far vaster scale than modern intellectuals can conceive. But these bourgeois have alienated themselves from their own creativity because they cannot bear to look into the moral, social, and psychic abyss that their creativity opens up. Some of Marx's most vivid and striking images are meant to force us all to confront that abyss. Thus, modern bourgeois society, a society that has conjured up such mighty means of production and exchange, is like the sorcerer who can no longer control the powers of the underworld that he has called up by his spells. This image evokes the spirits of that dark medieval past that our modern bourgeoisie is supposed to have buried. Its members present themselves as matter-of-fact and rational, not magical, as children of the Enlightenment, not of darkness. When Marx depicts the bourgeois sorcerers, remember, too, their enterprise has conjured whole populations out of the ground, not to mention the spectre of communism. He is pointing to depths they deny. Marx's imagery projects, here as ever, a sense of wonder over the modern world. Its vital powers are dazzling, overwhelming, beyond anything the bourgeoisie could have imagined, let alone calculated or planned. But Marx's images also express what must accompany any genuine sense of wonder, a sense of dread. For this miraculous and magical world is also demonic and terrifying, swinging wildly out of control, menacing and destroying blindly as it moves. The members of the bourgeoisie repress both wonder and dread at what they have made. These possessors don't want to know how deeply they are possessed. They learn only at moments of personal and general ruin. Only, that is, when it is too late. Marx's bourgeois sorcerer descends from Goethe's Faust, of course, but also from another literary figure who haunted the imagination of his generation, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. These mythical figures, striving to expand human powers through science and rationality, unleash demonic powers that erupt irrationally, beyond human control, with horrifying results. In the second part of Goethe's Faust, the consummate underworld power, which finally makes the sorcerer obsolete, is a whole modern social system. Marx's bourgeoisie moves within this tragic orbit. He places its underworld in a worldly context and shows how, in a million factories and mills, banks and exchanges, dark powers work in broad daylight. Social forces are driven in dreadful directions by relentless market imperatives that not even the most powerful bourgeois can control. Marx's vision brings this abyss close to home. Thus, in the first part of the manifesto, Marx lays out the polarities that will shape and animate the culture of modernism in the century to come. The theme of insatiable desires and drives, permanent revolution, infinite development, perpetual creation and renewal in every sphere of life. And its radical antithesis, the theme of nihilism, insatiable destruction, the shattering and swallowing up of life, the heart of darkness, the horror. Marx shows how both these human possibilities are infused into the life of every modern man by the drives and pressures of the bourgeois economy. In the course of time, modernists will produce a great array of cosmic and apocalyptic visions, visions of the most radiant joy and the bleakest despair. Many of the most creative modernist artists will be simultaneously possessed by both and driven endlessly from pole to pole. Their inner dynamism will reproduce and express the inward rhythms by which modern capitalism moves and lives. Marx plunges us into the depths of this life process, so that we feel ourselves charged by a vital energy that magnifies our whole being, and are simultaneously seized by shocks and convulsions that threaten at every instant to annihilate us. Then, by the power of his language and thought, he tries to entice us to trust his vision, to let ourselves be swept along with him toward a climax that lies just ahead. The sorcerer's apprentices, the members of the revolutionary proletariat, are bound to wrest control of modern productive forces from the Faustian, Frankensteinian bourgeoisie. When this is done, they will transform these volatile, explosive social forces into sources of beauty and joy for all, and bring the tragic history of modernity to a happy end. Whether or not this ending should ever really come to pass, the manifesto is remarkable for its imaginative power, its expression and grasp of the luminous and dreadful possibilities that pervade modern life. Along with everything else that it is the first great modernist work of art. But even as we honor the manifesto as an archetype of modernism, we must remember that archetypal models serve to typify not only truths and strengths, but also inner tensions and strains. Thus, both in the manifesto and in its illustrious successors, we will find that, against the creator's intentions, and probably without his awareness, the vision of revolution and resolution generates its own imminent critique, and new contradictions thrust themselves through the veil that this vision weaves. Even as we let ourselves be carried along by Marx's dialectical flow, we feel ourselves being carried away by uncharted currents of uncertainty and unease. We are caught up in a series of radical tensions between Marx's intentions and his insights, between what he wants and what he sees. Take, for instance, Marx's theory of crises. Crises that, by their periodic return, put the existence of the whole bourgeois society in question, each time more threateningly. In these recurrent crises, a great part not only of existing products, but of previously created productive forces, are repeatedly destroyed. Marx appears to believe that these crises will increasingly cripple capitalism and eventually destroy it. And yet his own vision and analysis of bourgeois society show how well this society can thrive on crisis and catastrophe. On one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other, by conquest of new markets and more thorough exploitation of the old ones. The crises can annihilate people and companies that are, by the market's definitions, relatively weak and inefficient. They can open up empty spaces for new investment and redevelopment. They can force the bourgeoisie to innovate, expand and combine more intensively and ingeniously than ever. Thus, they may act as unexpected sources of capitalist strength and resiliency. It may be true that, as Marx says, these forms of adaptation only pave the way for more extensive and more destructive crises. But given the bourgeois capacity to make destruction and chaos pay, there is no apparent reason why these crises can't spiral on endlessly. Smashing people, families, corporations, towns, but leaving the structures of bourgeois social life and power intact. Next, we might take Marx's vision of the revolutionary community. Its foundations will be laid, ironically, by the bourgeoisie itself. The progressive industry, whose inadvertent promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the workers through competition with their union through association. The immense productive units inherent in modern industry will throw large numbers of workers together, will force them to depend on each other and to cooperate in their work. The modern division of labor requires intricate cooperation from moment to moment on a vast scale, and so will teach them to think and act collectively. The workers' communal bonds, generated inadvertently by capitalist production, will generate militant political institutions, unions that will oppose and finally overthrow the private atomistic framework of capitalist social relations. So Marx believes. And yet, if his overall vision of modernity is true, why should the forms of community produced by capitalist industry be any more solid than any other capitalist products? Might not these collectivities turn out to be, like everything else here, only temporary, provisional, built for obsolescence? Marx, in 1856, will speak of the industrial workers as newfangled men, as much an invention of modern times as machinery itself. But if this is so, then their solidarity, however impressive at any given moment, may turn out to be as transient as the machines they operate or the products they turn out. The workers may sustain each other today on the assembly line or the picket line, only to find themselves scattered tomorrow among different collectivities with different conditions, different processes and products, different needs and interests. Once again, the abstract forms of capitalism seem to subsist: capital, wage labor, commodities, exploitation, surplus value, while their human contents are thrown into perpetual flux. How can any lasting human bonds grow in such loose and shifting soil? Even if the workers do build a successful communist movement, and even if that movement generates a successful revolution, how, amid the flood tides of modern life, will they ever manage to build a solid communist society? What is to prevent the social forces that melt capitalism from melting communism as well? If all new relationships become obsolete before they can ossify, how can solidarity, fraternity, and mutual aid be kept alive? A communist government might try to dam the flood by imposing radical restrictions, not merely on economic activity and enterprise. Every socialist government has done this, along with every capitalist welfare state, but on personal, cultural, and political expression. But insofar as such a policy succeeded, wouldn't it betray the Marxist aim of free development for each and all? Marx looked forward to communism as the fulfillment of modernity. But how can communism entrench itself in the modern world without suppressing those very modern energies that it promises to set free? On the other hand, if it gave these energies free rein, mightn't the spontaneous flow of popular energy sweep away the new social formation itself? Thus, simply by reading the manifesto closely and taking its vision of modernity seriously, we arrive at serious questions about Marx's answers. We can see that the fulfillment Marx sees just around the bend may be a long time coming, if it comes at all. And we can see that even if it does come, it may be only a fleeting, transitory episode, gone in a moment, obsolete before it can ossify, swept away by the same tide of perpetual change and progress that brought it briefly within our reach, leaving us endlessly, helplessly floating on. We can see, too, how communism, in order to hold itself together, might stifle the active, dynamic, and developmental forces that have brought it into being, might betray many of the hopes that have made it worth fighting for, might reproduce the inequities and contradictions of bourgeois society under a new name. Ironically, then, we can see Marx's Dialectic of Modernity reenacting the fate of the society it describes, generating energies and ideas that melt it down into its own air.